Also, we are very fortunate to be joined by our friends who will be providing sign language interpretation as well as closed captioners. Because of that, we encourage our speakers and all those who will be giving interventions to please speak a little bit slowly so that there would be ample time to translate your statements. And also, we would like to inform everyone that if you would like to see the closed captions or the subtitles, there is a feature in the Zoom channel where you can activate closed caption. You can find this at the bottom part of the screen. Just click on the box CC and choose the option Show Subtitle. All right. With that, I think we can start with the uh, program. By the way, this is Miguel from the ASEAN Secretariat, and we are joining everyone now from Jakarta. And to officially start our web forum, I have the honor of introducing our Deputy Secretary General for the ASEAN Economic Community, His Excellency Aladdin Rillo, to give the welcome remarks.
Okay, thank you so much, Miguel, for a very kind introduction. And also, thank you so much for joining this forum. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to this second webinar on disability inclusion and ASEAN economic integration. Let me also take this opportunity to thank our partners for this event, the ASEAN the ASEAN Disability Forum, and the ASEAN and ASEAN General Election Network for Disability Access, and for organizing this event together with the ASEAN Secretariat, and also for helping us in a number of activities in promoting disability inclusion in ASEAN. I understand also that we have officials from different sectors in ASEAN representing the different community pillars who are joining us in this webinar, as well as representatives from international organizations, private sector, as well as NGOs who are also with us today. Again, thank you so much for joining us in this webinar. I think we all know that disability exclusion is an important development challenge or issue in ASEAN. I think particularly during this pandemic crisis. I think 8 months into this crisis, the outlook for the region continues to remain uncertain and bleak. And definitely, this will have significant implications in terms of the size of the socioeconomic shocks from this crisis, which are expected to be much bigger and also more longer lasting compared to the previous crisis in 1997, the Asian financial crisis in 1997, as well as the global financial crisis in 2008. The way I see it, obviously, this would lead to more adverse outcomes for our vulnerable groups in ASEAN, including, of course, persons with disabilities. I think already we've seen how this pandemic crisis has been affecting this particular group. We've seen how the massive closures of schools, for example, has been affecting children with disabilities in terms of how they are able to access critical school resources. We've also seen how the disruption in public transport has been affecting persons with disabilities who have been very dependent on public transportation in their ability to move around, and also in terms of their ability to access a number of critical services that would affect their conditions. But I think we are also aware that even without this pandemic, right, the development consequences of disability are quite large in the region. Estimates suggest that within the region, there are around 17 million people who have suffered from various forms of disabilities. Whether the number is high or low, okay, depending on the availability of data, as well as the estimates that have been used, I think for me, one thing is very clear, that people or persons with disabilities as a group and on average are likely to have less education. They are also likely to have or worse health outcomes. Most likely also this group of people will have less employment and obviously higher uh, uh, poverty rates. I think what is more alarming, the way I see it, is that when you look at disability as well as poverty, these two variables are actually reinforcing with each other, right? In two different ways, right? Disability affects poverty and poverty affects disability. So that's why the implications are really quite large. And also given the seriousness of disability exclusion in the development in ASEAN, my personal view here is that we cannot afford to just forget about mainstreaming, right? Persons with disabilities into our community building efforts. Obviously, there is a need to align our policies to make sure that the policies are able to serve the interests of this vulnerable group of people. And at the same time, we need to make sure that we're able to create the environment by making sure that we have the actions that are needed to protect this vulnerable group. That's why I'm very happy that within the region right now, we have the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025. For me, it is a very important tool for the region to be able to mainstream persons with disabilities into our community building efforts. And again, that is an important way of doing that. If you look at the Enabling Master Plan 2025, actually there are a number of measures that are very much related to the ASEAN economic community. We counted around 25 actions, okay, related to AEC. These are actually actions that would try to promote greater economic opportunities in the region by promoting, for example, entrepreneurship and employment that would obviously would impact on our vulnerable groups, including persons with disabilities. For example, if you look at the SME development work under the ASEAN Economic Community, our objective is not only to enhance the productivity of small businesses in the region, but I think part of our agenda is to make sure that we're also trying to engage persons with disabilities as key agents into these different entrepreneurial activities in ASEAN. Similarly, if you look at our work on intellectual property rights, we also pay a lot of attention in terms of protecting the intellectual property rights of people with disabilities. Similarly, within the ASEAN Economic Community, we organize once a year our Community of the Whole Conference. This is a conference that invites different sectoral bodies under AEC as well as outside AEC. And during that occasion, we also try to all engage with civil society organizations, as well as organizations that are working directly to people or persons with disabilities. I think the idea there is to engage with these civil society organizations to make sure that we're able to promote issues of economic empowerment of these vulnerable groups into our economic integration agenda. Despite all these efforts, I think more is still needed in my view. I must admit that within the AEC blueprint, we're not actually very explicit in terms of how we can mainstream, okay, people with disabilities into our integration agenda. Which I'm hoping that the next blueprint under the AEC will become more conscious of the importance of mainstreaming disability into the different sectors under AEC. But despite that, in my personal view, I think there are different possibilities by which we can mainstream disability into economic integration agenda in ASEAN. In addition to, of course, aligning economic policies to the interest of promoting, okay, the welfare of people with disabilities, I think it is also very important in my view to be able to support different projects that have disability focused interventions. Similarly, I think there is a need to identify, in my view, economic sectors within the ASEAN economic community that would provide the most successful implementation of mainstreaming of disability under the AEC. I'm talking of sectors like, for example, SME, finance, and transport. At the same time, I think it is very important that we have, or we should be able to incorporate disability into the monitoring of the ASEAN economic community. Of course, that depends so much on how much data do we have, which I think we still need to work on. But for me, it is very important to make sure that the monitoring of AEC takes into account disability considerations as well, to make sure that whatever we do in terms of addressing this particular group becomes more evidence-based. But beyond this, I think there are two areas where we think will be very important, two important considerations that will make our interventions very successful. One, I think for me, there is a need for us to change our mindset, right? Even though all of us recognize that there are positive economic benefits of disability inclusion in development, in terms, for example, of the impacts on earnings and productivity, I think what is missing right now, the way it see it, is that it's the limited understanding of issues and practicalities related to mainstreaming of disabilities into our development agenda. The way I see it, unless we look at disability inclusion as a form of economic empowerment, I don't think it would be very difficult, the way I see it, to really appreciate the importance of mainstreaming disability into the AEC. That's why I'm very happy that when I look at the program, there is a session that tries to look at different strategies, right, into how we can better mainstream disability into the AEC. And I'm really looking forward to that session because I myself would want to learn more how we can do it. Secondly, I think mainstreaming disability would require a more holistic approach, the way I see it. It requires the responsibility of everyone in society and the economy. For example, if you want to provide decent jobs to people with disabilities, I don't think it's an issue of just providing access to better transportation or better public space, right? But I think more than that, we have to make sure that the other conditions that would relate to the working conditions, for example, of people with disabilities are put in place. That's why it is very important that everybody has to chip in, okay, to this process of mainstreaming disability into the AEC. Again, in your program, I know that session 2 would look at how investment in disability inclusion can be better implemented in the region. So again, this is, I think, a very important step to make sure that we better understand what this mainstreaming of this disability into the AEC is all about. In closing, let me just again emphasize the importance of mainstreaming into the development agenda. Within the AEC, while we are trying to integrate our markets, while we are trying to deepen our financial markets, while we're trying to remove all these trade barriers, I think at the end of the day, market integration is about people, right? Market integration is actually not the end by itself. It's only the means for us to achieve our development goals. Whether we're able to do that, we have to make sure that all these initiatives under AEC are always contributing to the people which are the most important, okay, beneficiary of all these integration initiatives. I also would like to leave you with some words from Mark Twain. Mark Twain is one of my favorite authors. And in one of his works, he said, kindness is the language by which the deaf can hear and the blind can see. Reflecting on those words, I think those are very powerful words, right? If we want to make sure to mainstream people with disabilities into the AEC, I think understanding them is the most important thing that we can do. Only by understanding them, in my view, that we will be able to empower them. So with these words, thank you so much again for joining this webinar, and I look forward to the discussions in the following sessions. Thank you so much, and good afternoon.
Thank you, DSG Aladdin, for the welcome remarks and very inspiring words. Truly, the framing of the web forum could not have been better presented after hearing the words from DSG Aladdin. So, at this point, I would like to invite Dr. Sita Somrit, Assistant Director and Head of Division of the Poverty Eradication and Gender Division of the ASEAN Secretariat, to give the objectives of this web forum. Dr. Sita?
Good afternoon, everyone. From my part, I would just summarize the objectives of this second web forum. So this is the continuation of the first web forum, which focused more on the ASEAN sociocultural community. So we hope to raise awareness on disability inclusive analysis and approaches in responding to and recovering from COVID-19 pandemic. We also hope to be able to identify solutions and pathways to mainstream, as the SGR has mentioned, the rights of persons with disabilities in the context of the implementation of the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025. For this webinar number 2, we are really looking forward to be able to discuss how we can engage or we can mainstream the disability issue into the work of the ASEAN Economic Community and also the ASEAN Economic Integration. There will be discussion on challenges as well as opportunities for persons with disabilities in the context of economic integration and economic development of ASEAN. So we hope that we will learn good practices from both public and private sectors on the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is the objective of this second webinar. And just to apply a forward-looking approach, we also would like to mention as early as now that the next webinar, or the webinar number 3, will focus on smart cities and ASEAN connectivity. So this is a very quick brief on the objectives of this webinar and the whole series of the web forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sita, for presenting the objectives of this web forum. So before proceeding to the first session, we would like to inform everyone that the participants who are joining us in this web forum are coming from various sectors. No? So primarily, we invited ASEAN sectoral bodies from the ASEAN Economic Community pillar. And also joining us are sectoral bodies from the ASEAN Sociocultural Community pillar. There are also our partners, organizations of persons with disabilities, civil society organizations, and the private sector, as well as international development organizations, so our friends from the different UN agencies. So with that, just before jumping into session 1, we would like to remind everyone to please, at all times, keep your microphone on mute so that we don't have any feedback or background noise. No? And please do maximize the Zoom group chat by sending your comments and inputs. And again, our colleagues are monitoring the YouTube channel. If you have any comments, we will capture those and reflect it here in the Zoom group chat. So with those reminders, I would like to hand over the moderation of session 1 to Pa Lim, the chair of the ASEAN Disability Forum. Pa, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome very much to the first session of this webinar. And this session, we are talking about how to identify pathways for disability inclusion in ASEAN economic integration. We are very pleased to have 4 very distinguished speakers with us. And at the end of this session, we will invite you to to ask your questions, raise your questions, and the four speakers will try their very best to answer you. Where we cannot find, we need more time to find the answer for you. We will indicate so, and then we would get back to you as soon as we can. Our very first speaker today is Mr. John Paul Cruz, a very strong advocate for persons with disabilities from Philippines, and he will be talking to us on how to locate persons with disabilities in ASEAN economic integration. Over to you, John Cruz.
Thank you, Pat Lim. More and more governments and business leaders around the world are looking at people with disabilities as employees, entrepreneurs, consumers, and drivers of sustainable economic development. As ASEAN engages the global community through its economic integration framework, it can capture a big proportion of the more than 50% of consumers with disabilities and their loved ones. In ASEAN alone, more than 90 million people have some forms of disabilities, almost equal to the size of Vietnam or the Philippines. And if we include their loved ones, we would have an estimated 250 US dollars of annual disposable income. This is equal to the combined GDP of Vietnam, Cambodia, Lao PDR, and Brunei. Disability is a concept that changes over time, and it has two main elements. The first is a person with an impairment. Second is attitude and environmental barriers. We see people with disabilities or people with impairments as human beings, people with basic human rights as anyone else? Or can the buildings, computers, offices, websites, and information that we create be accessed by persons with disabilities? You see, if we say no to these questions, we are not allowing a person with an impairment to be part of our society, to be part of our lives. And one way to address disability is through inclusion. And the formula is very simple. You have person with an impairment, you add an accessible environment and an attitude that is based on human rights principles. Including persons with disabilities in the labor market will increase the gross domestic product of developing countries in ASEAN by 7%. And as consumers, the 1.3 billion people with disabilities around the world would have a conservative estimate of 1.2 trillion US dollars of annual disposable income. This is more than 1/3 of ASEAN's GDP. If we consider the baby boomers and aging population in ASEAN member states like Singapore, Thailand, or Vietnam, this number will significantly increase. Often as we age, we tend to have trouble in seeing, even with eyeglasses, or hearing, even with hearing aids. Sometimes we have difficulty walking or climbing steps, remembering or concentrating, washing all over or dressing, communicating, being understood or understanding. We become very anxious, nervous, worried, and sometimes we become very sad or depressed. If governments and businesses make their products and services accessible to consumers with disabilities, you would expect that the same goods and services will be accessible to older persons or to the society at large. Studies in different parts of the world show that businesses employing people with disabilities have higher retention rate, they have increased productivity, They have improved positive reputation and they attract more talents. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, under Vietnam's leadership, ASEAN continues to pursue its three main priorities: promoting integration and connectivity with ASEAN, working with the global community for peace and sustainable development, enhancing the responsiveness and institutional capacity of ASEAN. To achieve these, ASEAN has to keep its efforts disability inclusive. For example, in its digital integration framework, if the ICT that ASEAN member states procure or manufacture are accessible, it'll be able to connect more ASEAN people. And as we are connected, we are also empowered to access information through closed captioned or sign language interpreted TV news programs, to access online health services, access life-saving health emergency warnings. We could buy and sell goods and services using mobile phones. And we can stay in touch with loved ones even while social distancing. Of course, this would also increase our productivity while working from home and perform better paying jobs that use digital skills. If ASEAN continues to include people with disabilities in their development agenda, the region will also likely meet its sustainable development goals. As you may know, the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the SDG Global Indicators have explicit references to persons with disabilities in the areas of education, employment, reducing inequality, sustainable and inclusive cities, means of implementation using data, and peaceful and inclusive societies. Clearly, disability inclusion is the way for ASEAN to achieve sustainable development. Finally, if ASEAN wants to be more responsive and enhance its institutional capacity, it can work closely with persons with disabilities and their organizations. To be responsive to the needs of people with disabilities, ASEAN has to constantly improve its capacity as an institution, and it needs to provide many things: products, services, processes. In a way, it needs to make these intuitive and useful for people with a wide range of preferences and diverse abilities. When we promote financial inclusion, ASEAN could encourage its member states to make information about these programs to the blind, partially sighted, and to women with disabilities. If banks are not yet physically accessible because of the lack of wheelchair ramps or because automated teller machines are too high for wheelchair users to reach, there should be a policy or a process for people with disabilities to open a bank account, to make online payments, or deposit a check using their own computers or mobile devices and assistive technologies. In conclusion, including people with disabilities in ASEAN economic integration discourse will make it more competitive, its economic development more equitable, and it will fully integrate the region in the global market. By supporting the adoption of the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025 that is mainstreaming disability rights in the region, AEC has taken important steps towards inclusion. Inclusion is the key to a cohesive and responsive ASEAN community that enjoys a resilient and sustainable development. Thank you very much and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, John Paul Cruz, for your message. Our next speaker, Dr. Sri Nantatsu, is no stranger to many of us, and I had a great pleasure of working with him the last few years on bringing out and finalizing the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025. He did a fantastic job with coming up with a masterpiece on how to mainstream the rights of persons with disabilities within the ASEAN region. And next year, we'll see him on the global stage and want to congratulate him as well on the new appointment. Today, Dr. Siri will be talking to us on how to mainstream the rights of persons with disabilities in the ASEAN economic community. Dr. Siri, please.
Good afternoon, PT, and good afternoon, everyone from Bangkok, Thailand. First of all, I like to thank the ASEAN Secretariat, especially the kind words of DSG from the AEC, which are music to both my ears and my heart. Let me begin by looking at my summary page. Next page, please. I have 5 key points to talk about how to mainstream disability rights in the ASEAN economic community. The first point of departure is that we have to change our mindset. We have to look at disability rights as human rights, and recognizing and discharging these rights are a matter of responsibility and not philanthropy or pity. If we cannot do this, I don't think we can proceed. We have to look at people with disabilities as the rights holders, and we owe them duty and responsibility. The second point is the positioning of the AEC itself. I would like to encourage the AEC to look, perceive, and project itself as a key enabler of and for persons with disabilities who are economic agents and not merely welfare recipients. The goal is to create inclusive ecosystem that promotes equally accessible economic rights for everyone, including those with disabilities. The third point is we should identify barriers and priorities through the document that our leaders adopted in 2018, the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025. Of course, our very, very first priority is the pandemic that we are facing at the moment. And the consequences will be very severe unless we try to mitigate and prepare for it. COVID-19 policies and measures must incorporate concerns for persons with disabilities. Secondly, we need to look at the inaccessibility and inequality that are still prevail in the financial and insurance services. We need to make AEC, the top priority of AEC should be financial inclusion. And I think that has been reiterated by my friend Pong previously. The fourth point is to recognize increasing risks and opportunities in the expanding Asian and ASEAN economic integration through the likes of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, that is going to be concluded, I understand, quite soon. This will expand ASEAN from 10-member integrated economic zone into 16 countries. And through RCEP, we will see a lot of opportunities as well as risks, especially for persons with disabilities. So I would like to encourage also our colleagues in ASEC to be mindful of those with disabilities, that how RCEP, the like of RCEP, can provide them with greater opportunities and less risks when we integrate deeper. The last point, my final point of summary is we should promote consultation and participation in the work of AEC. The AEC is part of the ASEAN community, and it cannot work and be viewed as an isolate, independent, and exclusive organ. Otherwise, its deliverables and those of ASEAN as a whole will be viewed as illegitimate and deviate from the community values. I have a few more slides which will underscore the points that I highlight here. If we can go to the next page, please. Yes. I just want to highlight that when we drafted the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan, we try to we base it on these key principles stemming from ASEAN Charter, the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Bali Declaration, ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, but most importantly is the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. I like to highlight that this is the start of a decade of action. We have 10 more years within which to conclude our Sustainable Development Agenda. And I surely hope and remain hopeful that this decade will include persons with disabilities as well. If we can turn to next page, please. This page highlights the three community pillars, from the political security community to the economic community and socio-cultural community. So you can see that ASEAN has three sub-communities, and we need to work together. I think a word that has been used is holistic, and I really appreciate that kind of mindset, that we need to look beyond the silo of each of these communities. Next page, please. Now, when we talk about key action points in each of the three communities of ASEAN, I like to underscore 3 points. Number one is prioritization of these action lines, 25 of which belong to the AEC, is aligned with and based on ASEAN community blueprints itself. So when you look at the master plan and you implement the master plan, you are in fact implementing your own community blueprints. However, they are not an exhaustive list of member states' obligation. So member states are encouraged to go beyond what the enabling master plan specify in the document. Next page, please. I use as example, and I think the SG Aladdin has already highlighted this. As an example, we need to identify also the relevant sectoral body. So I use as example the key action point number 1 for the AEC, which is to develop policies that encourage inclusivity of persons with disabilities and to remove obstacles of employment and business opportunities. So I use at the third column, you will see the relevant sectoral organs of ASEAN. So you see the senior economic officials meeting, you see senior labor officials meeting, and interestingly, there is also the ASEAN Finance and Central Bank Deputies meeting. So I hope that each of these sectoral bodies will look at the enabling master plan as an enabler and complementary tool in the discharging of their own community blueprints. You can go quickly to the next 2 pages to see how the enabling master plan touch upon various aspects of economic activities that relate to the lives of persons with disabilities. Next page, please. So this one, which already touched by DSG Aladdin, the protection of intellectual property rights of persons with disabilities. So I think you have also the meetings of relevant agencies pertaining to intellectual property as well, beyond what has been stated here on the page. Next page, please. And I think that these last two if you look at transport, we also have transport sectoral body that should look at transport facilitation and sustainable transport for persons with disabilities as well. I like to end here, PT, and turn over to you. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suri. Our third speaker is Mr. Rajiv Kumar Gupta, and he's from the United Nations Capital Development Fund. So, Mr. Mr. Rajiv, would you please take over? Thank you.
Thank you, PT, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, ASEC, Dr. Rillo, as distinguished speakers and panelists and participants. Thank you for having me here. The presentation that I'm going to give is mostly looking at, how can market systems approach lead to more mainstreaming happening for people with disabilities. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is just a kind of a representation, and we all know that there are several economic and social barriers apart from the political and legal aspects of things. But if you look at in terms of the employment, you look at in terms of the wage differentiation, you look at in terms of the rights to accommodation, well living, health, social protection, all of that aspects is something education and capacity building. All of these aspects needs to be looked at and needs to be looked at in a way that the market also is able to absorb and service and respond to these needs of people with disabilities. Can we go to the next slide? And our previous esteemed speakers have already talked about COVID-19, which has kind of aggravated the issues and the gaps that exist traditionally with the segment we are talking about. And that relates to the healthcare services, financial inclusion has been talked about, access to food, the kind of income that used to be there, the income stream getting reduced, the kind of support services that's reduced during the social distancing and the COVID-19 socioeconomic impact that's been there. Travel restrictions, and with people with disabilities, which are mostly in the informal sector, the kind of impact is manifold compared to the other segments in the society. And that also leads to a lot of economic instability. And thus the kind of risk is much higher. And that is where we need to really look into these perspectives to say how we can build back better, and the kind of SDGs and its achievements that was being talked about. And in this space of things that we need to look into, how can market respond to these kind of efforts? Can we go to the next slide, please? And financial inclusion has been talked about, and one of our esteemed panelists earlier had really quantified the kind of GDP positive impact, the kind of other income impact, the kind of consumption, local economic impact that's going to be there if we are able to mainstream and include PWDs in the kind of economic scenario that's there. And from a savings perspective, also if you do financial inclusion, that's kind of going to provide the financial institution a substantial amount of money to really lend to and benefit and invest into enterprises that we have been talking about. We already know that for PWDs, the non-performing loans average has been lower compared to the normal population. So what I'm trying to mention here is there are already business cases in terms of PWDs having less absent days compared to, and less turnover compared to other employees. In terms of economy, it's already been talked about GDP. And in terms of technology, there is this whole assistive technology market for PWDs that the elderly and for the elderly that is projected to be around $31 billion by 2027. So the point that I'm trying to make is there is already a business case, but why isn't this business case being taken up by the public and the private sector to mainstream the PWDs into the society and into the economic markets? Next point, please. Next slide, please. And that's where we really need to look into market-based approaches and market systems that need to engage relevant markets. to generate those livelihood opportunities and have the potential for growth. And these are not just financing in nature. Market opportunities can be in terms of different technology solutions, can be in terms of different digital solutions, can be in terms of investments and employment. And that is where what we're trying to push forward is to look into the economic empowerment, spurring social inclusion, rather than the inverse of it. And how can that be possible in this whole arena of now moving towards inclusive digital economies? We did talk about financial inclusion, and financial inclusion is one of the most important intervention that should be looked into, both from the public and the private sector perspective. And we moved from financial inclusion to digital financial inclusion because that brought in more of the cost effectiveness and cost efficiencies and improved margins, which also made the private sector balance in terms of the services they can offer at a larger scale and higher volume. But we also realized that finance is always not a good entry point. You really need to look at what is the right solutions and right technology and digital solutions for specific segments. And here we're talking about people with disability. And how with those kind of technology and solutions, finance can ride over those solutions. So sometimes the entry point activity may be different in terms of digital solutions, non-financial digital solutions, and finance may ride over these. And that's where when all the countries are trying to move towards inclusive digital economies, we really need to see how inclusive these digital economies become for people with disability. Can we move to the next slide, please? And that's where the role of technology and inclusion in mainstreaming the rights of people with disabilities. And we did talk about financial inclusion and financial service providers being able to inexpensively and provide adaptive services to individuals. So with the kind of digital data being generated, the kind of customization possibilities that's going to happen in terms of providing products and services increases. And that's why we can look into the segment of providing that to the people with disabilities. How can companies come forward and what kind of innovations they can take place in terms of providing adaptive services and equipment to meet the increasing demand of the particular segment we're talking about. Also in terms of employment, and there are, our previous speakers have talked about certain sectors which kind of can absorb some of the people with disability segment people. PWD itself is not a homogeneous group and we need to really look at, but just for an example, in terms of e-commerce and logistics, we have models where you have a deaf person being able to provide that logistic and being part of that team to do the logistic delivery at at the home point. So how can different kind of companies in different sectors be able to look into people with disabilities and the challenges they have and customize towards it is something that we really need to look into if you're looking at the market systems approach and how we can support those companies. And how can we really lower the cost? So we do talk about digital, we do talk about technologies, but a lot of these are quite prohibitive in nature. Secondly, a lot of these are also great in terms of solutions, but they're not customized to the country needs or in terms of the local languages when we talk about this particular segment. And we need to really look into these kind of solutions. And on top of that, we don't really have, and data has been already cited as one of the most important need, and disability disaggregated data and how the financial institutions or the private sector companies or the public sector is able to disaggregate data and use that data to create information to insights to influence, and influence to decision making. That kind of a spectrum and the lineage has to be kind of pushed forward too. Next slide, please. And this is where I wanted to present to you a three aspect framework or a triad framework that we think would be able to push forward the mainstreaming agenda of people with disabilities. I believe I'm not able to, okay, my sound is too low. I hope you're able to hear me now. One is the aspect of innovations, and innovations should not be looked into something like that is pretty new. We have been, with the support of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australian government, doing a lot of innovations around different segments. And there's one example that we had where we were trying to do digital literacy gamification model, and that was successfully done. But when we thought about looking at how can this gamification module be also applicable to people with disabilities, there was a need for a top-up support. There was a need for a technical support. And you don't have those kinds. So there is a whole space of topping up that will be able to provide, use existing solutions and top it up to customize it for people with disability segment. And that's where the innovation platform can work too. The second is we have always been looking at a top-down innovation model. So you really have great companies who have been looking at assistive technologies. But there are also grassroots family level innovations because their son or their daughter or their family members has some kind of a physical disability. And they have come out with solutions, which is not great, but that really partially meets some of the requirements of this particular segment or the daughter or family members. How can we look at and identify these grassroots innovations, which is low cost, local in nature, and kind of assist them into looking that in terms of the business growth and make it a market-led solution? Those kind of things need to be very much required. We have also been talking about the one of the major supporter and institution that is the government that has been looking really into this segment in terms of policies or schemes or kind of financial supports. And we really need to look into the government to people or people with disability and people with disability to the government level of transactions, either in procurement or anything else, and see what kind of innovations we can bring about. And there are organizations that can enable that to happen. The other thing is in terms of the finance aspect itself. And when we talk about this particular segment and we talk about their needs, it's not a very short-term need. So we, with the assistance of the Australian government, we did a whole customer journey of people with disability in Laos, but specifically looking at the financial institutions. And of course, one of the major bottlenecks it's already mentioned here was in terms of the ramps being not there or the ATMs being high. But infrastructure investment is a long-term finance investment. But you don't have those kind of finance models to look at from a portfolio approach, to look at how can this give you a return in a longer term rather than looking at just as a short-term return. And that's where I think also the blended finance platform needs to be developed. And that's where I think the role of grants and returnable grants, debt, equity, guarantees, all of these needs to be combined together. And on a case-to-case basis, be able to support innovations, both grassroots innovations, looking at private sector who wants to really absorb employees, PWD employees, look at technologies being invested into. And that's where the blended finance will be able to respond to. And these, apart from these two being looked into at the ASEAN level and being set up, the thing about data has been talked about. But the challenge is how do you integrate it operationally into the ASEAN workings or into the organizational workings? So just as an example, we have been, and with support from the Australian government, we did a lot of work on gender. And there was sex disaggregated data modules developed at the ASEAN level. Presently, we are doing the ASEAN Monitoring and Evaluation Financial Inclusion Framework. And there are several working groups, ASEAN Coordination Committee for MSMEs, ASEAN Working Committee on Financial Inclusion, Payment and Settlement Systems. I think we also need to kind of develop specific guidance notes, which are operational in nature about what can financial institutions and fintechs do if you're talking about financial inclusion. What can companies do and different kind of sectoral companies do if you're talking about inclusion of PWDs at different levels? So apart from the data segregation aspects of inclusiveness at the private sector and public sector, I think this mainstreaming of looking at these kind of guidance notes being developed by subject experts would really help in widening the reach of these operational modules and use of them within the public and the private sector space. So thank you all. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rajiv, for your interesting thoughts on the use of technology to promote more inclusiveness in the financial sector. In the interest of time, please feel free to list down your questions in the chat box. I really noticed that there was one question raised by a friend from Malaysia, and Dr. Seri has made a quick answer to that. But if any of you got more questions or need more elaborations, please feel free to use the chat box to raise your questions, and we will then arrange for the various speakers or whatever resource that we have here today to answer your questions. Our fourth speaker today is our dear lady, our dear friend of ours, Lan Ah from Vietnam. She is a board member of the Vietnam Federation on Disabilities, and today she's representing the network of inclusive entrepreneurship in ASEAN. Lana, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lim. I'm very honored to join the meeting today. Today about the mainstream, the topic and mainstream, the rise of persons with disability in ASEAN economic communities. But the most of our slide that I mentioned about the Vietnamese situation on the people with disability and employment. Next slide, please. Okay. According to the General Statistics Office in Vietnam, we have the 7% of total population is the people with disabilities. It's around the 6.2 million of the people as a disability. And in May this year, UNDP have a rapid assessment related about the people with disability and COVID-19. In the screen, you can see some information related about the people with disability that we have the 82% of the people who respond this assessment is concerned about the protecting their health care during the COVID-19, and almost 100% that they concerned about the financial security, and you can see that 28% of them saw their income decrease in March this year, and more than 70% of people with disabilities, they have the monthly income of less than 1 million Vietnam dong. Is around the less than 50%, $50. They have to use their saving during the difficult time. And next slide, please. And here is the figure related about why people are unemployed or not working for job. That according to the Vietnam National Survey on Disability in 2016, launched in Jan 2019, we have the 33% of people with disability are in the labor force, and compared to 83% of people without disability. Discrimination is the main remain the big barrier preventing people with disability from applying, receiving, or retaining job. Instead of the discrimination can limit the continuance of the existing employment or hamper of opportunity for care advancement, as well as prevent the incident of the safe or healthy work condition. And of course, according to the VDC again, disability is one of the most frequent reasons mentioned. You can see that there are 14% of them not being a part of a labor force. Having a disability may prevent them from seeking a job because of a concern about the discrimination, physical limitation due to the inaccessible transportation or workforce, or the other physical barriers, as our colleagues mentioned before. The rate of people with disability being denied to employment in exceptional highs around more than 53%. Other type of the discrimination included that people with disability working without the labor contract, low wage, or the non-payment, and not getting promoted in their job due to their disabilities. Having low education level is also a reason limiting the number of jobs they can perform, making their choice that they're more limited than the other rest of population. And I think that the same situation in almost the country in ASEAN. And all of these barriers that contributes to the people with disability being left out from the labor market and condemning their fall into or remain into poverty. Next slide, please. And here in Vietnam, you know that Vietnam is same other country here. Vietnam is developing country with a low population of the people with disability in labor market. And you can see that almost more than almost the 33% because of the two main reasons that one is about the discrimination and the other barrier in access to education. There are mainly 6 types of the barrier for people with disability to enter the labor market. The first one is a low education awareness related about people with disability. Second is that the limited to access information because of the that the information is not with the easy version, like they haven't got a sign language interpreter or they haven't got the website accessible. And the other things is related about the access to the public building or the transportation, and also the gap in the legal framework and lack of enforcement, lack of the necessary qualification and barrier on access to the capital. Yes, next slide, please. In Vietnam, we have several extensive legal framework on a labor and employment for people with disabilities. We have the law on disability in 2010. We have law on vocational education in 2014. We have law on employment in 2013, and we have labor code updated in 2019. Here is the on the screen they not see the outdate. And we have a large number of decree and circular detailing and guiding about the law. For example, like now just recently, last week, we have the stream for assistant people with disability in next 10 years at the 2021 to 2030 that enclosed in decision of the Prime Minister number the 1191. Yes, this is the mention about the employment for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, and you can see that we have the we have national legislation and implementation practice. Sometimes a gap between that. People with disability who have received the vocational training is still low, and is still in the shortcut, so they cannot follow the professional trainings. The the other gap is the methods of the national occupational skill assessment that not accept to own type disability. Sometimes in some country they refuse the as a study and not accept for the people with deaf or people with blind, and some type with is applied for the wheelchair user. And employment for people with disability have not been mentioned in almost a national social economic development plan and strategies. Sometimes that mentioned in one word or three words that encourage the people with disabilities. That's enough, and it's not enough for the detail. How can we put them into that social economic development plan or strategies in the future of the implementation? And the gap, another gap, that the business sector, they still refusing to recruit people with disability. Maybe that they think that people with disability is not enough the capacity, they not enough the educate to apply to that job. And some they cannot know about the tax exemption or tax deduction for them if they have the people with disability, because of the some country is not mentioned clearly about this. Yes, and in the past, Vietnam, they had the quota for all the business sector that they should hire 2 to 3% of the labor in their business have a disability. But now in our policy, there is that mention encourage the business sector to hire people with disability. Or in Thailand, we have only that here in Thailand that they mention about the people with disability in its business sector. It means that 100 people, they should have one people with disability, but not much when they much country like Thailand can do like that. Next slide, please. So conclusion, I mentioned here we have some recommendation for this. First, we should ensure that the government support package is the disability inclusion by ensuring coverage to include people with disability working in the informal sector, and providing information in the on the package is accessible format with a simple or transparent procedure. The second is about the developing a new skill set for people with disability to explore new employment opportunity in the industry for 4.0 working environment, or the 5.0 working environment in the future. Included working from home or adapting a new online business practice. Provide accessible online employment and education platform. Promote the new online employment opportunity for people with disability in the private sector, especially in the COVID situation like this time. Next slide, please. And we need to enhancing the implementation of the policy on employment for people with disability, improving the quality and efficiency of vocational training, improving the quality and efficiency of vocational training management within their duty and power. Additional that recommendation and supporting measure that improving the people with disabilities, access to education, mobility, accessibility, collecting the utilize the data on disability, introducing a measure to advocate to the for the inclusive of the people with disability in one area of social and economic activity, and of course ensure the number of people with disabilities should be high in the business sector. It should be the increase in the future, and the important thing that raising awareness in community about the importance of job with the people with disability. Yes, this is my presentation. Thank you for your cooperation.
Thank you very much, Lana, for sharing with us the situation of the employment of persons with disabilities in Vietnam and some of your very insightful recommendations. I think in the interest of time, I have not seen any more new questions being raised but for this session. But in the interest of time, I will now move on to session 2, and I will invite our dear friend Miguel to moderate this session. But please feel free to continue asking your questions, and I'm sure we can answer them towards the end of session 2. Miguel, please.
Thank you, thank you, Pat Lim. Once again, this is Miguel from the ASEAN Secretariat, and we are now proceeding to session 2. But before we proceed to session 2, we would just like to take note of and recognize friends who identified themselves in the group chat. So we have representatives from the Statistics Department from Indonesia and Cambodia. We also have representatives from the private sector in Myanmar, and we also have the Department on Skills Development from the Philippines. So just to let everyone know that there are many sectors and stakeholders who are represented and participating in our web forum this afternoon. So to proceed to session 2, I would like to invite, before inviting our speakers, just to remind us that session 2 will be focusing on investing in disability inclusion. In the previous session, we saw some of the pathways for disability inclusion in ASEAN economic integration, and we have seen from the previous presentations that indeed there is an economic case for inclusion, disability inclusion, and this value proposition is beneficial not only for persons with disabilities but also for businesses. And also we have seen some approaches such as blended finance, improving data, and we saw concrete examples of this in the case of Vietnam when Lan Anh presented the situation in Vietnam. And of course, some key issues were also identified, some barriers, and some recommendations. So now we are moving towards specific focus on investing in disability inclusion. And we have 2 speakers in this session. Our first speaker will be sharing thoughts and insights on the question, what are the approaches to and benefits from integrating and investing on disability inclusion? And for this, we would like to invite Ms. Chai Chai, Chief, the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion, Social Development Division of UNSCAP. Ms. Chai Chai, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to have this presentation as well as a conversation with you on the benefits and approaches in terms of disability inclusion. So in my presentation, I will cover 3 issues. First is why disability inclusion, and secondly, go into the economic benefits and possible approaches, and especially those that are widely recommended in promoting disability inclusion. And then finally, we can take a look at the practices of disability inclusion in the context of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So why disability inclusion is necessary? According to the WHO estimates, persons with disabilities constitute at least 15% of the world's population, amounting to more than 690 million people in Asia and the Pacific. So the number of persons with disabilities is also expected to increase as the population ages in the region. Between now and 2030, the number of persons aged 65 and over in Asia and the Pacific is expected to increase by 50%. Based on UN estimates, more than 46% of persons aged 65 and over will live with disabilities. At the same time, the Asia-Pacific region is the most disaster-prone region in the world. According to data from 2018, almost half of the natural disasters worldwide occurred in our region. So the frequency and intensity of natural disasters are expected to increase in the future with climate change, resulting in increasingly unpredictable weather conditions. This increase in natural disasters is expected to result in a rising proportion of persons with disabilities as well. So with such a large number, it's definitely high time to address disability inclusion as well as quite urgent. It's a policy issue for all governments now. It's now in terms of the necessity beyond the number, the projected increase of persons with disabilities, as many of the speakers before me mentioned that leaving no one behind is enshrined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. As you know, 2030 Agenda aims to bring transformative change to our society by addressing many interconnected issues in a holistic way. Now, at the center of this agenda is how to support and empower the vulnerable and marginalized groups. Persons with disabilities often face tremendous barriers to social, economic, and political participation, and therefore require the utmost attention in the policy design. Next slide, please. Disability inclusion is not only necessary for supporting persons with disabilities, but highly beneficial from an economic perspective. Persons with disabilities and their broader communities constitute a highly underserved client base for accessible goods and services. So based on the study conducted by Return on Disability, which is a company that provides advice to the private sector on disability inclusion, they estimate that the number of persons with disabilities globally will be reaching 1.3 billion people, which constitute an emerging market the same size as China, with a disposable income of approximately 1.2 trillion US dollars annually. So when persons with disabilities are excluded from the economic system, you can imagine the huge losses that are incurred. Based on an ILO study, the unemployment and underemployment of persons with disabilities incur huge social and economic losses estimated at between 3 to 7% of GDP. Next slide, please. Having reviewed the economic benefits of disability inclusion, let's take a look at the approaches to disability inclusion. First, I want to highlight human rights as a fundamental approach to disability inclusion. Because persons with disabilities, like all other persons and population groups, are entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. And the state, which means government, is the principal duty bearers with legal obligations of progressively realizing human rights under international human rights law. This means that governments have a responsibility to persons with disabilities the same way they have a responsibility to all other citizens under their legal commitments, which include a number of international conventions and covenants, such as those on civil and political rights, and on economic, social, and cultural rights. And most importantly, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has been ratified by all ASEAN member states. At the regional level, Asia-Pacific countries have also adopted the Incheon strategy to make the right real, and the Beijing Declaration and Action Plan to accelerate the implementation of the Incheon strategy. In 2018, ASEAN countries have taken a major step to adopt the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan 2025 to mainstream disability inclusion into all pillars of ASEAN community, which highlights the rights-based approach. This is indeed a milestone achieved by ASEAN countries. Next slide, please. So I want now talk about the twin track approaches. What do we mean by twin track or dual track approaches? To promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities, in general, a combination of both disability-specific and mainstreaming measures are required. Disability-specific measures are interventions that are targeted at persons with disabilities due to their very specific needs. These measures are only available for persons with disabilities. For example, employment quotas for persons with disabilities have been adopted by a number of countries, including ASEAN countries, as well as disability, pensions, benefits, and allowances. These are only available for persons with disabilities. So this is one track, disability-specific measures. Now, the other track or approach is disability mainstreaming. It refers to the measures to integrate disability-sensitive measures into the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of all policies, programs, and services. Examples include ensuring that general employment service centers and one-stop shops for social assistance services are physically accessible for persons with disabilities. Online platforms are accessible where applications for these services have to be completed via the internet, for example, for blind persons and the visually impaired persons. And that publicity and outreach for these services are accessible, for example, easy to read versions, advertisements with captioning and sign language interpretations. So these are twin track approach when we implement them together. And these are the most effective way to address the needs of persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. In order to effectively implementing disability mainstreaming measure, I want to highlight the importance of promoting accessibility as a prerequisite in the discussion. First, the commitment to accessibility should be a whole of government commitment involving all ministries. Ministries responsible for the built environment, information, and communications, ICT, and transport, in collaboration with disability agencies, needed to consider providing guidance to their staff, to their service providers, ensure that the infrastructure, the services they provided are accessible to persons with disabilities. And to achieve that, they needed to establish guidelines and standards for all to follow. And universal design is central to the successful integration of accessibility and disability inclusion into policy solutions and measures. Investment in accessibility through universal design from the outset, the very beginning, is often much less costly than doing so at a later stage. And in fact, a universal design approach will help increase revenue. I want to give you an example from Australia. Improvement in accessibility has enabled 3.8 million persons with disabilities in Australia, out of a total of 4.2 million persons with disabilities, to take overnight trips in the first quarter of 2017, amounting to 17% of the total tourism expenditure in this period. So this is the economic benefit of accessibility in general. Also in Australia, there's a state called Victoria. Its council, Victorian Council of Social Services, indicate that increasing the number of universal design-based homes would save the state government more than $48 million each year through reduced home care, residential aged care, and hospital costs based on the aging population. So this indicates both the benefits and the necessity of promoting accessibility as a fundamental approach to address disability inclusion. It's vitally important for successfully implementing disability in mainstreaming measures. Now, move to the next slide. I also want to highlight the other very important approach, which should be implemented in conjunction with the twin track measures. Nothing about us without us, perhaps it's familiar to all of you. It is critical that persons with disabilities, including through organizations of persons with disabilities, are adequately and meaningfully represented, engaged, and consulted through the process of developing and implementing disability-specific and disability-inclusive measures, because they know best what their needs are and where policy and program gaps lie. So having the voice of persons with disabilities, involving them at every stage of policy design and implementation is truly important. Now, in terms of multi-stakeholder approach, we also needed to consider what other sectors needed to be involved beyond the different ministries. So we needed to look at the private sector, where vast resources are. Now, increasingly, private sector is becoming an important partner in our disability inclusion efforts, championed by governments, by CSOs. And these private sector players can offer the resources, networks, expertise, and the technologies to scale up disability inclusion initiatives. And businesses have grown increasingly enthusiastic about disability inclusion as inclusive branding becomes more prominent and also common in the corporate world. I want to give you an example. Facebook, for example, produces a regular diversity report emphasizing the richness of a diverse workplace, including how to support persons with disabilities. And another company from Japan, the Mirero company, run by persons with disabilities, provide accessibility advisory services in order to improve accessibility and promote inclusion in the workplace. Another example from Canada, the company is called the Toronto Dominion Bank Canada, TD Bank. They created the Assistive Technologies Program and Lab, which works in consultation with employees with disabilities to identify assistive technologies that may support their work and shows how technology can be utilized for the benefit of all employees. TD Bank reported that economic benefits derived from incorporating accessibility in the workplace were evident through increased productivity and efficiency. Now, example from our region, the Singapore Business Network on Disability. This network was established in 2015, working on disability inclusion in business. Its members include Accenture, AIG, Barclays, BP, Deutsche Bank, and Standard Chartered Bank, etc. Network members exchange information on how to make the workplace more accessible and ways to promote the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the workforce. So these are the examples from both our region and other parts of the world to just indicate how important to engage different sectors in our effort to promote disability inclusion. Next slide, please. So finally, I want to highlight in the context of COVID-19, what we can do, some tips in terms of both disability-specific measure and the disability mainstreaming measure to support persons with disabilities, given the urgency to address their needs and the importance of this matter to both governments, civil societies. So first, we must ensure that all pandemic responses are disability inclusive, including through close consultation, meaningful participation, and partnerships with persons with diverse disabilities. So this is mainstreaming approach. Secondly, we need to provide continued access to all goods and services, including here, some disability-specific support services targeting persons with disabilities. Thirdly, we must deliver public information in accessible formats with public communication messaging that is respectful of all population groups, including persons with disabilities. Fourth, we need to make COVID-19 related medical and quarantine policies, services, and processes accessible and disability inclusive. This is disability mainstreaming approach. Fifth, we have to safeguard the income security and the livelihoods of persons with disabilities through social protection and employment support to ensure an adequate standard of living for them. This can include some specific support directly targeting at persons with disabilities. Six, the final point I want to also mention, we should not forget those persons with disabilities who are living in institutions and some facilities in our responses to COVID-19, and to make sure their rights and well-being are safeguarded. Thank you very much. I look forward to having further discussions with you.
Thank you very much, Chai Chai, our friend from SCAP. I think the three key takeaways we can get from the presentation is the two-track approach, disability-specific measures, and mainstreaming disability inclusion. The other one is the importance of ensuring accessibility. And the last takeaway is meaningful and substantive engagement of persons with disabilities and also the private sector. No? So thank you very much for the very informative and comprehensive presentation. So now I would like to invite our friend from GRAB, Ms. Ilaria Chan, Group Advisor on Social Impact Investment, to share her insights on the question, what are the best practices and approaches to integrating and investing on disability inclusion measures? Ilaria, over to you.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Hi, everyone. My name is Ilaria. I am the group advisor to GRAB. It is really an honor today to be able to be invited here and share with you our mission in promoting disability inclusion. Why don't we start off with a video? Next slide, please.
I would say they have zero awareness when it comes to all.
There be like a barrier.
Anything happens, macam mana? Dia tak dengar.
Yeah, they shouldn't be on the road.
很危险，其实。Saya tak nak ambil risiko.
I know there are many people out there with negative thoughts about deaf drivers. Maybe they don't have the trust that we can actually drive safely. But they need to know that we're actually good drivers. We may have lost one of our senses, but we still have our eyesight. When I'm driving, I'm always concentrating on the road, and I'm very much aware of my surroundings. One of the reasons that I joined Grab is because I want to prove to the hearing people that I can be on my own. I can actually get by on my own. I can be independent. I know I can't change the negative opinions overnight, but I hope they'll understand that we, the OKUs, including the deaf, are just like other human beings.
Thank you so much for showing that. Now, that was a video on some of our efforts in Malaysia. Piloted in 2018, Grab Malaysia started by partnering with the deaf community through Malaysian Deaf Association to identify pain points of our deaf partners while on the platform. And we then took these findings to translate them into improvements into our platform. Break the Silence is actually the name of the campaign of Grab's commitment to become a more inclusive and accessible platform for the deaf community, to welcome and empower those who want to earn a living by being a driver, merchant, agent, or delivery partner with Grab. Next slide, please. Now let's take a step back and just look at the big picture here. Southeast Asia is on the cusp of a very pivotal transformation. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the stats. This is a huge market. We have more than 640 million people across the region, larger than the EU, larger than North America. And in the next 5 to 20 years, the region will continue to see explosive growth in the number of mobile internet users and a boom in digital services. It is estimated that Southeast Asia's digital transformation, if successful, could potentially generate another $1 trillion in ASEAN's GDP by 2025. So looking at all the stats, what does it mean? Now, while economic growth is skyrocketing, the rich-poor discrepancy gap also has this potential of widening even more. And we must ensure actually that the growth story that we're enjoying right now does not leave anyone behind, especially the disabled community. Next slide, please. So who are we? I don't know if everybody knows Grab, but for those of you who don't, we are Southeast Asia's #1 super app mobile platform. We have 3 core business segments: on-demand transport, on-demand deliveries, which include food delivery, parcel delivery, grocery delivery, and essentials delivery, and our financial technology arm that includes payments, loans, insurance, and wealth management products. We also have a telemedicine JV that we've launched in Indonesia called With Ping An Good Doctor. So we are present in 394 cities in 8 countries in Southeast Asia. So as the currently largest technology company in Southeast Asia, we share the mission and responsibility with our public and private sector partners to improve the livelihoods in the region and to drive Southeast Asia forward. Next slide, please. Now, I would love to just quickly take everyone back to when Grab started. So 8 years ago, Grab was founded by Anthony Tan and Huiling Tan, who were Harvard Business School classmates. And they came together with a mission to solve the problem of safety in Malaysia, which at that time, taking a taxi in Malaysia was pretty dangerous, especially for young women. So they basically started the company with what Uber did in the West, but bringing it to Southeast Asia and then modifying and improving it to cater it to the Southeast Asia customers. Moving forward, Grab actually has maintained being a double bottom line company, which is really looking at maximizing financial profit to be a profitable company, but at the same time, making sure that Grab is contributing to positive societal impact. Since then, we've actually evolved into an everyday super app. Our mission has expanded to improving financial inclusion to the underserved, to improve livelihoods for people in Southeast Asia by providing earning opportunities through our platform. We also want to make sure that we are partnering with governments, with companies to make sure the infrastructure in these countries are being improved, since our primary platform function was transportation. But more importantly, as we look at all our business verticals, we believe that technology, and more specifically platform technology, can really be used to dramatically improve livelihoods across the region and be used as a force for good. Now, disability inclusion really, in our opinion, involves practices and policies designed to identify and remove barriers, such as physical communication and with attitude, actually, as well, that would hamper individuals' ability to have full participation in society so that they can enjoy the same privileges, same opportunities as people without disabilities. And many of the speakers before me have really put it so well, is how do you provide dignified employment to the disabled community, not pity, not philanthropy. Now, allow me to introduce you to a few of our driver and delivery partners. Next slide, please. So please meet Francis Tay. Francis is a great example of one of our driver partners on how we drive digital inclusion. Now, Francis was a pretty recent amputee. He lost his right leg in 2015, but undeterred in the face of adversity, he actually persevered through to make his ends meet by becoming our driver partner. We facilitated Francis's onboarding process through working with the traffic police, the Land Transport Authority, Singapore Enable, etc., to identify a suitable vehicle for him, to get it retrofitted with the necessary technology and expedite the approval process so that Francis can drive safely and conveniently. Next slide, please. Please also meet James Teo, who is a deaf driver. He's one of our top rated drivers. And actually 3 years ago, even the press picked up on this beautiful story. So James, was working, and one of the customers that ordered a ride that day turned out to be a blind customer. And really, we're so blessed with technology because the customer was able to book the ride through the voice over Android TalkBack features on his app. And James, of course, was able to drive with us because of the in-app features that we have to allow deaf drivers to thrive. So then James picked up this customer. And at the end of the ride, the blind rider, signed thank you with sign language to thank James. And James held the hand of the rider in appreciation. Now, looking back just now at His Excellency's quote, Mark Twain quote, on how kindness is where deaf can hear and blind can see, I actually felt really emotional linking it to the story because that's exactly what this was. Now, what James and many other deaf drivers are able to do working with our platform is only possible too because we partner with the Singapore Association for Deaf, which is a voluntary welfare group that partners with private companies such as us to provide public education in deaf culture and sign language with the goal of providing more job opportunities for the deaf community. So we're really grateful for these partnerships. Next slide, please. Please also meet Sumia. She is a 40-year-old wheelchair-bound delivery partner. She decided to be a Grab food delivery partner because it makes her independent and allows her to earn her keep. Now, she used to have a desk job, but actually her fingers were weak and it resulted in her dropping papers and things all the time, and her coworkers would become impatient with her. And she ends up saying that she prefers being a Grab food delivery partner as it makes her feel useful to the community. And she is frequently seen in the Tampines area in Singapore. Now, of course, there are still challenges, especially with wheelchair-bound delivery partners. So we're continuously addressing options, for example, adding wheelchair as a vehicle option for the delivery partners, and also within our app to not assign deliveries beyond a certain distance, like 3 to 4 kilometers for our PWD delivery partners. We also try to exclude areas that are not wheelchair friendly, so they don't have to waste time to reject orders. But we're just getting started. There's still so much that we need to improve on together with the public sector, with the rest of the private sector. Next slide, please. So when we look at disability inclusion, really, I mentioned about our double bottom line vision as a company. Social impact really is not an option or a side activity that we do at Grab. It really has been baked into our DNA from day one. And any business decisions, expansion decision we make, we take into account first and foremost, what impact are we creating for society? When we look at disability inclusion, it really is about leveling the playing field, right? Effective inclusion requires us to understand the factors that contribute to certain communities being excluded, and we find concrete and creative ways to help reduce their disadvantage. provide sustainable resources to uplift these communities so they can live a normal and independent life. They can gain employment. And I think that financial independence and confidence are actually the two top things that our driver partners tell us that they gain by joining our platform. So just looking at a little bit of numbers, right? The Grab platform actually has empowered people with disabilities, including deafness, cerebral palsy, or motor impairments. Over 1,100 persons so far with disabilities earn an income with Grab today. And we're just scratching the surface. We hope to grow that number exponentially in the future. We note that there's actually a pretty sizable PWD community in Southeast Asia, as mentioned by previous speakers as well. And amongst the challenges that they face every day, they struggle to find employment. This is where we actually believe the Grab platform through technology can help to support, because we can provide them with a viable launchpad that helps them to not just earn an income, but also to really provide them with practical real life experience on how to manage a business, manage customers, who could really help them foster greater confidence as a professional. I'll give some examples too on features in our app that could help ensure a more seamless experience with our PW partners. So mentioned just now, for example, for deaf driver partners, our app provides an in-app notification to passengers to inform them that your driver is deaf, and disables the in-app calling features to smoothen the communications between them and the passenger. And there are signs in the car that you can actually see most of the time hanging from the back of the seat to provide guidance on how passengers can interact with our drivers. For example, for wheelchair-bound delivery partners, I mentioned just now, right? We want to add wheelchair as a vehicle option for delivery partners. We want to make sure we don't assign deliveries beyond a certain distance that's not manageable for them, and to exclude areas that are not wheelchair friendly so they don't have to waste time to reject orders. And I think that looking at all of the above points when we review about approach, the most important thing for us is that private-public partnership is absolutely key. We would not be able to do any of that without the support, collaboration, partnership, guidance, mentorship from governments, from nonprofits, from other private sector players. So we really hope and endeavor that we can come together even more in the coming days to serve the PWD community in Southeast Asia. Now, next slide, please. I believe that real life stories are the most powerful testimonies. So why don't we take a look at another story of Nias and Siti, who are our partners in Malaysia. Please. I think it's the other video, yeah. Correct. Thank you.
Jangan pandang kita sebagai golongan yang simpati, bagi sokongan. Kita sama-sama mau maju lah. Kita sebagai pemandu Grab, kita ada pelbagai cabaran. Untuk sementara ni, saya dan isteri saya sharing satu kereta. Di mana dia akan buat dulu, lepas tu saya. Okey, mungkin kita bertanya-tanya macam mana OKU ni bawa kereta dengan pakai tangan sahaja. Alright, inilah jawapannya. Yang ini fully dikontrol oleh tangan. Kalau kita tekan bawah, minyak. Kalau kita tekan dalam, brake. Ini fully adjustable and senang diguna. Yang ini boleh pasang dekat mana-mana kereta. Saya nampak dekat Grab company ni, dia bagi satu peluang untuk berdikari. Di mana sesiapa pun boleh bawa kereta. Sama ada orang biasa, orang OKU, sesiapa, dia bagi opportunity. Kami tak perlukan simpati. Apa yang kami perlukan adalah peluang dan sokongan daripada masyarakat.
Actually, semangat dan kekuatan Siti dengan Nias setelah menjadi inspirasi dekat kita dengan Grab. Kami percaya dengan actually Abang Nias yang apa yang you lakukan untuk warga OKU. Jadi kita ingin mempromosikan Nias memberikan servis dekat kita punya laman web dan media sosial.
I feel so. That's actually, you know, when I come to know to my wife about the Grab, so I told her, if there's this opportunity that Grab gave me to promote and, you know, to make it these things, it's a join, you know, the Grab, I'll be very glad.
Bukan itu saja ya, Nias, Siti. Pihak Grab nak memastikan ada wakil OKU yang terlibat dalam semua inisiatif kami seperti Driver Representative Committee atau DRC, dan kami nak melantik wakil OKU di setiap kawasan supaya isu-isu dan malu malas dari pihak OKU dapat dibangkitkan dan ditangani dengan baik. Dan Grab sangat besar hati nak menawarkan pelantikan sebagai wakil pemandu di Lembah Kelang kepada Nias dan Siti. Apa kata? Okey tak?
Yeah, sure, definitely I will do it. This is something that, you know, there's contribution that we can give to the communities for the, you know, the vocational communities. So I'm very, very, very glad, and my wife is as well.
Thank you, Nias.
They will do it.
We are very happy to have you in our family.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You know, I've watched that video many, many times. Every time I watch it, I still feel emotional because that is what we hope for all the PWD community out there that we can do for them. They said it, he nailed it. We don't need sympathy. What we need are opportunities and support from society. And it is our greatest hope that this is what we can do for them. You know, it is really greatly beneficial to our economy when we include the disabled, and we have to find a sustainable way to do it. You know, Grab is not a charity. We are a full-on for-profit tech company that seeks to run an effective and efficient business that also drives society forward with us. Hence, actually, when we look at the efforts for disability inclusion, it can be a win-win if the right infrastructure is in place. We can provide sustainable opportunities for this group to have dignified employment, gain independence. We, as a private company, benefit from more partners on our platform to provide productive services for the people of Southeast Asia. And I think more importantly is we're doing our part to enrich livelihoods of the underserved people in Southeast Asia. We believe in using tech for good. How can we use our platform to narrow income inequality and access inequality? And I think if I have to sum up what I've learned from all of you today is that we, Grab, by no means, we're not there yet, but we know that we are off to a strong start. And we know that this is so important to recognize daily that we have so much to learn from everyone, and that the public, private, and people partnership is key and is paramount. If we're in committed collaboration together, then we really will be able to drive disability inclusion for our brothers and sisters in that community. So let's fight the good fight together. It is an honor to be with you all and looking forward to collaborating with you all. Thank you. Yeah, that's our quote. Yeah, and I guess the last slide is if anyone wants to reach out, the next slide is my information. You can reach out to me. Thank you so much for your time and for your patience in listening.
Thank you, Ilaria, for the presentation. It's truly not just informative, but very inspiring. And we assure the participants that we will be sharing all the presentations, including the links to the videos that Ilaria shared with us. And I think what we can quickly get from Ilaria's presentation is that there is indeed existing concrete examples of how innovative approaches such as what Grab is doing now in giving life to this how their economic value proposition of disability inclusion in the private sector and how it can respond to social impacts and at the same time addressing the profit issue or need or the bottom line of the private sector, no? And I think it answers the question that we saw from the YouTube channel. There was a question on how to translate the policies and all of these recommendation into concrete action. No? And I think this came from our friend from Cambodia. And I think, Ilaria, your presentation really hit the nail on the head by showing concretely how approaches such as maximizing online platforms and retrofitting vehicles so that persons with disabilities can be included in the labor force, no? And ways to customize. And it's not really expensive and as you rightly said, Grab is really starting strong and taking the lead, no, in the region in showing how it can be done. So now we still have a couple of minutes. I think if we can check the the Zoom group chat for any questions that participants might have. Previously, we saw a question from our friend from Indonesia. If there is a certain percentage in the ASEAN region for employing persons with disabilities. I think based on the information we have right now, there is no standard percentage across ASEAN. However, there are separate policies being adopted by the individual ASEAN member states in terms of employment quotas. No? So maybe that is one item that this forum can take note of when we move forward to the next web forum on the series. No, we would like to ask if there, looking at the Zoom group chat, we don't see any other questions. Maybe we can allot just a couple more seconds if there are other people who would want to ask questions in the group chat, in the Zoom group chat box. And again, our colleagues are monitoring the YouTube channel. If there are any questions there. All right, it appears like there are no more questions. So with this, we would like to thank Chai Chai and Ilaria for giving such substantive, informative, and truly inspiring presentations in session 2. So now we move to the synthesis and our recommendations, no? Just to take stock of what were the key discussion points that were raised during the presentations. And for this, I would like to invite once again Dr. Sita Sumrit from the ASEAN Secretariat to give a short presentation. Dr. Sita, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for having the ASEAN Secretariat here. As for the synthesis, it's just a very short summary of what we have learned today. It may not do justice to the details that all the speakers have provided us. So for the synthesis, the overall challenges, there are still barriers for persons with disabilities to be fully and economically empowered, starting from the point of education, training to financial inclusion. However, in terms of regional commitment, the picture is not grim, but rather promising, with the 25 key action points in the enabling master plan itself. And as Dr. Seri has pointed out, the member states are encouraged to go beyond the action points in the enabling master plan. Also, there are arising opportunities for the next work plans and blueprint of the economic community, including the inclusion of disability into their M&E exercise. There has been, of course, the whole of government and the whole of ASEAN community approach. So this is the way forward for the inclusion of persons with disabilities into our economic integration and development, as well as a very healthy level of willingness to engage and leverage private sectors and the engagement with the CSOs, including this web series with the ASEAN Disability Forum. In terms of pathways and solutions, I think the fundamental part from the conversation today is for us to recognize persons with disabilities as economic actors and economic agents with their own economic human rights, whether it's from being consumers to employees and entrepreneurs. Also, it's important for us to position the ASEAN economic community as the enabler through advocacy, consultation, and participation. I think there are a number of AEC ASEAN sector bodies that could be considered as potential champions on the issues of disabilities. The SGR has mentioned already the finance sector, tourism sector, and the transport sector, for example. It's important also for us to anchor this whole issue in the context of sustainable developments and the SDGs, given that this year is the start of the decade of actions, and I put it in capital, especially on inclusive economic development, on decent work, and on reducing inequalities. Again, we will not be able to achieve all the objectives and all the listed solutions if we don't promote accessible environment, infrastructure, and of course, attitude. There's a need to address gaps in market system development, including informal sector. I think that's a very pertinent point from this dialogue. How then we can address informal sector, include informal sector in the conversation on disabilities and the AEC, and tap the potentials of financial, digital, and data inclusion. So I think the points of Rajiv is very important for us to look at the nitty-gritty of what do we mean by financial inclusion and inclusion itself. And we will continue. So this is similar to the one of the solutions from the first web forum. We will continue to share good practices and innovative solutions, especially for adaptability and accessibility purposes. So this is a quick synthesis from this second web forum with the focus on AEC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sita Sumrit, for the synthesis and summary of the key points and recommendations. Before handing over to Pat Lim to officially close the web forum, we would like to announce that after Pat Lim gives his closing remarks, we will have a photo session. So after Pat Lim gives his remarks, we will invite all the participants. If you want you can open your video, your screen, so that you can join the photo session. Also, one last announcement, the presentations and the links to the videos are already uploaded in the Zoom group chat, so you can access that later. So with this, we now invite Pat Lim, the chair of the ASEAN Disability Forum, to give his closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Miguel. And let me quickly thank everybody for taking time off your busy afternoon on a Monday to join this very meaningful webinar. And just be on the lookout for the announcement for the third in this series. And as you mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about smart cities and connectivity for persons with disabilities during this COVID-19 period. I hope we have gathered a lot of thoughts, inspiration, and wonderful memories of what can be done for a person with disabilities in this employment sector that many people are facing challenges with now because of the present COVID-19 pandemic. And I hope that the work is never ending, it's only a beginning. And I hope that we can all work together to ensure that persons with disabilities in all walks of life within ASEAN can find a meaningful place to be financially independent and be included within the community that they come from. Thank you very much, ASEAN Secretariat, for doing all the behind-the-scene work to make this webinar possible. I want to thank my colleagues from Agenda and also ASEAN Disability Forum for helping out in the behind-the-scene logistical arrangements. And also want to thank the Australian government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for their continued support to enable the work of the ASEAN Disability Forum as well as IFES and Agenda to promote the rights of persons with disabilities through the ASEAN Enabling Master Plan. Thank you very much, everybody. We hope to see you very soon in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat Lim. So at this point, we would like to invite all the participants, if it's possible for you to open your screen so that we can take a photo of everyone. No? So there are several screens with all of our faces. While we're waiting for our friends, the participants, to open their screens, we would like to take this opportunity to thank Sin, our sign language interpreter, for having the strength and stamina for to do this overwhelming task. Usually, there are two interpreters who will undergo, who would take turns, but I think Sin, you did a wonderful job in doing the interpretation. We also would like to thank Adi and Raisa, our closed captioners. It's a fantastic job that you were able to reflect the statements, the discussions in the closed caption. So I think we are ready now to take the photo. So please smile, everyone, so that we can take lovely photos of all the participants. So on three, 1, 2, 3. And the next group. Okay. Smile. 1, 2, 3. And one more. Okay. 1, 2, 3. All right. So with that, thank you very much for joining this web forum. And just like what Pat Lim said, please, we look forward to welcoming you all to the third web forum, wherein we will focus on smart cities and ASEAN connectivity. So from us here in Jakarta's ASEAN Secretariat, thank you very much.